In early 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached a stage where the Japanese Empire was losing territory on multiple fronts, but still controlled wide areas of Southeast Asia. For the United States and its allies, the Philippines campaign of 1944 to 1945 was central to a wider strategy. Cutting Japan off from its oil and raw material sources in the Netherlands East Indies, and using Philippine bases to support later operations toward Taiwan, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands. After the landings on Leyte in October 1944 and on Luzon in January 1945, attention turned to the remaining Japanese garrisons scattered across the archipelago, including those in the Visayas. The Visayas formed the central belt of the Philippine archipelago, a cluster of medium-sized islands, including Panay, Negros, Cebu, Bohol, and smaller surrounding islands. Their location astride sea routes between Luzon in the north and Mindanao in the south gave them importance out of proportion to their size. Cebu City and Iloilo on Panay were the second and third largest urban centers in the Philippines, with ports, warehouses, and nearby airfield sites that could support either Japanese interdiction of Allied shipping or Allied control of internal sea communications once retaken. For the Japanese command, these islands were part of a defensive system intended to slow Allied advances and protect maritime connections to remaining strongholds. By early 1945, forces in the central Philippines were subordinated to 14th Area Army and its 35th Army Formation under Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, whose headquarters had withdrawn from Leyte but still tried to exercise control over scattered garrisons. Estimates by American planners, based on radio intercepts and guerrilla reports, suggested that roughly 30,000 to 32,000 Japanese troops remained in the Visayas, concentrated in coastal towns and interior strongpoints around Iloilo, Cebu City, and on both halves of Negros. These Japanese units varied in quality and equipment. Some infantry formations and naval landing forces still possessed artillery, machine guns, and field fortifications prepared since 1942. Others had been depleted by earlier fighting, disease, and shortages of food and medical supplies. The tightening Allied naval and air blockade around the Philippines reduced seaborne resupply to a minimum, forcing many units in the Visayas to rely on local requisition of rice and livestock. Japanese operational documents and post-war testimonies indicate that higher headquarters expected these garrisons to delay Allied forces as long as possible, withdraw into interior defensive zones if necessary, and maintain control of key towns for as long as communications and supplies allowed. On the Allied side, the American 8th Army under Lieutenant General Robert L. Eichelberger received in February 1945 the task of liberating the remaining islands south of Luzon, including the Visayas and Mindanao. 8th Army's concept emphasized fast, limited-objective amphibious operations supported by strong air and naval forces, and by local guerrilla organizations. For the Visayas, planners allocated approximately 17,000 American troops, mainly the 40th Infantry Division and the Americal Division, with the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team in reserve. These forces were expected to work closely with an estimated 18,500 organized Filipino guerrillas already active on the islands. Filipino resistance had become a decisive factor well before the first 8th Army landing craft approached the Visayan beaches. Since 1942, various guerrilla commands recognized by General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters had formed regional military districts. In the western Visayas, Colonel Macario Peralta Jr. led a force that by 1945 numbered more than 22,000 men and controlled much of Panay's interior, confining Japanese troops mainly to Iloilo and a few surrounding towns. On Cebu, Lieutenant Colonel James Cushing's organization was estimated at around 8,500 fighters, containing Japanese units in the northern part of the island. Other districts under leaders such as Ruperto Canglion and local commanders on Bohol and Negros maintained intelligence networks, coastal watchers, and small airstrips used for clandestine supply drops. For the civilian population, the prelude to the battle combined prolonged occupation with the anticipation of renewed large-scale fighting. Japanese military authorities had introduced regulations on food distribution, movement, and labor, including forced labor on fortifications and roads, while attempting to maintain local administrations and some economic activity in the larger towns. In the countryside, communities interacted with both guerrillas and Japanese patrols, often supplying food or information under pressure from one side or the other. Reports sent from guerrilla districts to Allied headquarters described shortages of rice and salt, episodes of summary punishment during counterinsurgency sweeps, and the movement of villagers away from areas expected to become battlefields once American forces arrived. Intelligence assessments before March 1945 reflected these mixed conditions. 8th Army staff concluded that guerrilla control of inland areas would simplify initial landings on some islands, but warned that Japanese forces, if allowed to withdraw into mountainous interiors, could prolong resistance for months. Japanese higher command, aware of its isolation and limited naval support, calculated that holding the Visayan ports could still complicate Allied logistics between Luzon and Mindanao and provide fallback positions if other fronts collapsed. Between these competing expectations, the inhabitants of Panay, Negros, Cebu, and Bohol faced the prospect that their towns, fields, and coastal waters would again become operational objectives in a campaign planned and decided largely beyond their control. In the opening months of 1945, the initiative for operations in the Central Philippines shifted to the 8th U.S. Army headquarters on Leyte. Under General Robert L. Eichelberger, planners divided the Visayas into two interconnected but distinct campaigns, designated Victor the Ferron and Victor the Soing, because the north-south mountain spine of Negros effectively separated western Panay and northwestern Negros from Cebu, Bohol, and southeastern Negros. The 40th Infantry Division under Major General Rap Brush received responsibility for Victor Thrax, while the Americal Division under Major General William H. Arnold was assigned to Victor II, with parachute and other reserves held back on Leyte to reinforce whichever front met stronger resistance. Victor I opened with the concentration of the 40th Division's assault units and supporting naval elements on assembly points in Leyte Gulf. The division's recent experience in Luzon land operations gave headquarters some confidence that it could execute rapid amphibious landings, followed by inland advances without prolonged preparatory buildup. Air units struck known Japanese positions and supply areas on Panay in the first half of March 1945, while guerrilla forces on the island reported road conditions, minefields, and garrison locations, allowing the 8th Army staff to refine landing sites and early objectives. On 18 March 1945, elements of the 40th Division, spearheaded by the 185th Infantry Regiment and supported by a battalion of the 165th Infantry Regiment, came ashore near Tagbawan, several kilometers south of Iloilo City. The landing met no organized Japanese fire at the waterline, in part because Filipino guerrillas, estimated at around 23,000 on Panay and organized under Colonel Macario Peralta Jr., already controlled most inland areas and had forced Japanese units back toward coastal enclaves. At the beach, American soldiers moving inland encountered formed guerrilla companies in uniform, who immediately began acting as guides and local security, illustrating the degree to which the initial phase on Panay combined formal amphibious doctrine with pre-existing local control of terrain. From Tigbawan, the first priority was not the main urban center, but nearby airfields. Within the first days, patrols and company-size units advanced to seize the landing ground at Barrio Tiring near Cabatuan and the airstrip at Mandurriao, while engineers began work to restore both for use by transport and tactical aircraft. Japanese forces initially remained concentrated around Iloilo and a few satellite positions, avoiding counterattacks against the new beachhead, and instead relying on outposts and demolition parties to delay American and guerrilla patrols approaching the city. These choices reflected limited artillery and ammunition stocks, and a preference for conserving infantry strength for defensive urban and hill positions, rather than risking it in open coastal fighting. Parallel to the main landing, smaller detachments supported by guerrillas moved against Guimaras and adjacent small islands that controlled channels between Panay and Negros. These operations, carried out almost without opposition, secured anchorages and short sea routes needed for the next stage of Victor, the advance to Negros. The opening phase therefore established a pattern that would repeat elsewhere in the Visayas: formal amphibious landings on selected beaches, immediate link-up with pre-organized local forces, rapid seizure of airfields and ports, and an initial Japanese response characterized more by withdrawal and positional defense than by attempts to throw the attackers back into the sea. While Panay operations were still in their first week, preparations for Victor II reached their final stage. Intelligence from radio intercepts and guerrilla reports indicated that approximately 14,500 Japanese troops were present on Cebu, of whom only about one-third were assessed as fully combat-ready, but that they occupied an extensive belt of fortifications covering Cebu City and the approaches from the southwest. Around 2,000 of these troops in the northern part of the island were effectively contained by about 8,500 guerrillas under Lieutenant Colonel James M. Cushing, allowing Allied planners to focus the American Division's main effort on the urban area and nearby airfield at Lahug. On 26 March 1945, after naval bombardment of coastal positions, assault waves of the American Division's 132nd and 182nd Infantry Regiments landed at Talisay Beach, roughly 4 miles west of Cebu City. Again, direct fire from Japanese coastal positions was limited, but the defenders had laid a dense pattern of mines that destroyed 10 of the first 15 tracked landing vehicles reaching the shore and temporarily halted movement inland as later waves accumulated in the congested beachhead area. Engineers and infantry teams began to probe and mark safe routes through the minefields, while offshore warships remained ready to deliver additional fire should Japanese units attempt to exploit the temporary traffic jam. This combination of relatively light immediate fire with substantial engineered obstacles would shape the transition from the opening landings into the first sustained engagements around Cebu City. Strategic planning for the operations in the Visayas began months before the first landing craft approached Panay. Within the overall Philippines campaign, General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters assigned the southern and central islands, including Palawan, the Visayas, and Mindanao, to 8th U.S. Army as a distinct operational zone. The aim was not only to clear remaining Japanese garrisons, but also to secure internal sea lanes and air routes that would link Luzon with bases closer to Borneo and the Netherlands East Indies, and to create staging areas for future operations against Japan itself. Inside this framework, 8th Army staff divided the Visayan theater along the mountain spine of Negros into 2 linked but separate undertakings. Victor VI was to cover Panay and northwestern Negros. Victor VI would focus on Cebu, Bohol, and southeastern Negros. The immediate objectives were clearly defined: seize ports such as Iloilo, Bacolod, Cebu City, and Dumaguete, occupy nearby airfields, including those at Iloilo and Lahug, and then push Japanese forces away from coastal corridors that Allied shipping and air transport needed. Longer term, planners envisaged Panay as a mounting base where the 40th Infantry Division and, later, the 5th Infantry Division from Europe could stage for possible operations against the Japanese home islands. These goals were matched by a logistics scheme built around limited amphibious shipping and airlift. The same assault transports and landing ships that carried the 40th Division to Panay were scheduled to be turned around rapidly for later movements, including support to Mindanao, making time in port a critical factor in planning. Fuel, ammunition, and rations would initially come from depots on Leyte and earlier bases like Hollandia, then flow through improvised supply points at Iloilo and Cebu once their docks and warehouses were repaired. Engineers were instructed to restore existing facilities rather than build large new complexes, reflecting both resource constraints and the expectation that the Visayas would serve mainly as a stepping stone rather than a permanent concentration area. Operational concepts also reflected experience gained in earlier Philippine landings. 8th Army planners favored what later studies described as a light but aggressive approach, small but well-supported amphibious forces advancing quickly inland, relying on air and naval firepower and on local guerrilla organizations, rather than on building heavy static base structures. The presence of organized Filipino forces on Panay, Cebu, Negros, and Bohol allowed U.S. units to plan for shorter lines of communication, local procurement of some food and labor, and detailed guides to inland routes and Japanese positions, while also reducing the number of American infantry battalions required for initial assaults. Japanese planning started from a very different set of constraints. The 35th Army, subordinated to 14th Area Army, had been given responsibility in 1944 for the defense of the Visayas and Mindanao, but by early 1945, its ability to move units and supplies between islands had been severely reduced by Allied naval and air control. Operational directives emphasized holding key ports and airstrips where possible, destroying facilities that could not be defended, and withdrawing inland to mountain strongholds when faced with superior forces. In the Visayas, this translated into coastal defensive belts around Iloilo and Cebu City, combined with prepared positions in the interior of Panay, Negros, and the hills north of Cebu City, intended to sustain long-term resistance once coastal access was lost. Japanese staff documents and post-war interrogations suggest that 35th Army headquarters viewed the Visayas as a secondary but still significant theater. The main expectation was not to prevent landings outright, which was judged unrealistic given Allied superiority in shipping and air power, but to impose delays, inflict casualties, and tie down U.S. divisions that might otherwise be used on Luzon or in future operations toward Japan. Limited fuel and ammunition stocks, coupled with declining medical supplies, led to plans that accepted attrition and disease as factors and relied heavily on local requisition of food from rural areas, even at the risk of increasing tensions with the civilian population. Filipino guerrilla commands had their own planning priorities, partly military and partly political. Recognized units under leaders such as Macario Peralta Jr. in the western Visayas and James Cushing on Cebu had been receiving supplies and instructions from Allied headquarters since 1943 to 1944. By early 1945, they had drawn up detailed plans to secure interior regions, gather intelligence on Japanese dispositions, and conduct roadblocks and demolitions in step with U.S. landings. These organizations also aimed to demonstrate effective control over territory and population, expecting that their role in the liberation would strengthen their position in the post-war Philippine state. Information and morale were addressed through psychological warfare measures that operated alongside conventional planning. MacArthur's headquarters and associated psychological warfare branch units prepared radio broadcasts and leaflets aimed at both Japanese troops and Filipino civilians in the Philippines, including material that described Japan's deteriorating strategic position and outlined surrender procedures. Such methods did not replace military operations, but they formed part of a broader attempt to reduce Japanese willingness to fight on isolated islands and to reassure local populations that cooperation with Allied forces and guerrillas would be recognized and protected as the Visayan campaign unfolded. The first clashes in the Visayas unfolded not as a single set-piece battle, but as a sequence of local engagements around ports, airfields, and road junctions. On Panay, after the landing near Tigbawan on March 18, 1945, patrols from the 185th Infantry Regiment moved inland toward Cabatuan and Mandurriao, where Japanese forces had maintained airstrips serving Iloilo. Supported by guerrilla guides, these patrols encountered scattered outposts and demolitions parties, attempting to destroy equipment and facilities rather than defend them to the last position. Within roughly 10 days, organized Japanese resistance on the coastal plain was largely broken, and American reports described the Panay garrison withdrawing toward the interior and the northern part of the island, while guerrilla units took over policing duties in retaken towns. The entry into Iloilo City itself came with limited street fighting compared to other Philippine urban battles, but still involved exchanges of fire around warehouses, roadblocks, and a few reinforced buildings. Guerrilla units, familiar with the layout of streets and river crossings, often preceded regular troops into districts where Japanese detachments had already slipped away or were preparing to retreat. For local residents, the transition from occupation to Allied control brought both relief at the end of formal Japanese authority and uncertainty about food supplies, prices, and the reorganization of civil administration. Some buildings and port installations had been damaged by earlier bombardment and demolition, complicating efforts to restore commercial activity, even as military logistics became the priority. While Panay operations progressed, both American and guerrilla forces turned attention to sea channels and islands that linked Panay to Negros. Small detachments landed on Guimaras and nearby islets, encountering only token resistance. Securing these points allowed engineers to survey anchorages and ensured that the approach to the future Negros landing area at Pulupandan would not be threatened by coastal guns or observation posts. These minor actions involved relatively few troops but were significant for controlling movement through the Guimaras Strait and for establishing the pattern of combining regular infantry units with locally raised forces to gain quick control over key terrain. On Cebu, the first day's fighting followed a different pattern. When the American Division's 132nd and 182nd Infantry Regiments came ashore at Talisay on 26 March, the beaches were not covered by heavy direct fire. Instead, Japanese engineers had laid extensive minefields and booby traps, which disabled many of the first tracked landing vehicles and forced assault units to halt, while engineers marked safe lanes inland. Contemporary accounts note that this was the first time in the Philippine campaign that U.S. forces encountered mine belts of such density, and the disruption at the waterline temporarily confined several battalions to a narrow strip of shore. Once lanes were cleared, units moved toward Cebu City, initially meeting only light opposition from small Japanese groups carrying out delaying actions along the main road. By 27th March, American troops were on the outskirts of the city and began entering the urban area, while other elements crossed to Mactan Island to secure facilities in the harbor. On 28th March, combined operations by infantry and armor seized Lahug Airfield, positioned a short distance northeast of the city center, after a brief but concentrated exchange of fire with Japanese defenders who had prepared positions around the runway. From the Japanese perspective, these withdrawals into the northern hills conformed to earlier plans that emphasized conserving forces for protracted defense in rugged terrain rather than holding exposed coastal districts against a better supplied enemy. For civilians in Cebu City and nearby towns, the early days of the battle brought a rapid sequence of bombardment, evacuation, and reoccupation. Naval and airstrikes preceding the landings had already driven many residents to seek refuge inland or in less exposed neighborhoods. As American troops moved through the streets, some inhabitants emerged to provide directions or information, while others remained displaced because of damaged housing and uncertainty about Japanese positions in the surrounding hills. Similar patterns occurred in smaller coastal communities along the route from Talisay to the city, where villagers had experienced both Japanese requisitioning and guerrilla activity in the months before the landings. The opening engagement on Negros began on 29th March, designated Y Day in American planning. Before the main landing near Pulupandan, a small force from Company F, 185th Infantry, crossed ahead of the assault waves to secure the steel bridge over the Bago River, a structure essential for moving vehicles and artillery inland. The Japanese Guard detachment was surprised, and the bridge was held until larger formations arrived, allowing the main landing force to come ashore without facing a destroyed crossing. The subsequent advance into Bacolod and northward to Talisay encountered only intermittent resistance, as Japanese units again chose to avoid decisive combat on the coastal plain and instead fell back toward interior positions. Across these first engagements, contrasting operational approaches became apparent. U.S. and guerrilla forces prioritized rapid seizure of ports and airfields, using mobility, combined arms, and detailed local intelligence to bypass or isolate strongpoints. Japanese commanders, constrained by limited heavy weapons and supplies, made early use of obstacles and mines at the shoreline, then shifted to withdrawal and delaying tactics aimed at drawing the fighting into hills and mountains where the terrain might offset some Allied advantages. For the populations of Panay, Cebu, and Negros, the clash began not only with the sound of artillery and small arms, but also with the disruption of trade, agriculture, and everyday routines, as their regions became active theaters in the wider campaign for the Philippines. As the campaign in the Visayas moved beyond the initial landings, the character of the fighting shifted from rapid coastal advances to more difficult operations in broken terrain and against dispersed opponents. On Negros, after the capture of Bacolod and Talisay in early April 1945, the 40th Infantry Division confronted a Japanese withdrawal toward the mountainous interior of Negros Occidental and Negros Oriental. Estimates indicated that roughly 7,000 Japanese troops, including remnants of Army and naval units, were regrouping in the high ground of the north-central and eastern parts of the island. American forces, supported by several thousand guerrillas, had to extend supply lines along narrow roads and trails while dealing with ambushes, roadblocks, and the onset of the rainy season, which complicated vehicle movement. On Cebu, the American Division's rapid capture of Cebu City and La Hogue Airfield did not end organized resistance. Japanese forces, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 strong in the main central sector, had already pulled back to positions in the hills and ridges north of the city, including prepared defenses along routes toward the towns of Mandaue, Compostela, and Danao. These positions used natural features such as ravines and steep slopes, reinforced with bunkers and caves. U.S. infantry advancing along the coastal road and inland tracks experienced short, intense engagements at strongpoints, followed by further Japanese withdrawals, a pattern that increased the cumulative strain on units as they advanced through unfamiliar, compartmented terrain. The escalation of operations brought logistical and medical challenges for all sides. For U.S. forces, initial supply over beaches gave way to use of repaired piers and ports at Iloilo, Bacolod, and Cebu City. But inland movement still depended heavily on truck convoys subject to weather-related delays and on pack trains or human porters in steeper areas. Medical units reported cases of malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases among troops operating in swampy or forested zones, although the availability of quinine and other treatments limited long-term effects. Japanese units, cut off from seaborne resupply, increasingly relied on locally gathered food and on stocks accumulated earlier in the war. As fighting dragged on, diaries and post-war testimonies described diets reduced to rice, root crops, and occasionally forage plants, with meat and medical supplies becoming scarce. Command and control also faced growing complications. 8th Army Headquarters had to coordinate multiple island campaigns, Palawan, the Visayas, and later Mindanao, using a finite number of amphibious ships, air squadrons, and engineer units. Prioritizing tasks meant that some operations in the Visayas progressed in phases rather than through continuous large-scale offensives, as resources were temporarily diverted to other sectors. On the Japanese side, communications between the 35th Army Headquarters and local commanders on Negros and Cebu became intermittent as radios failed, operators were lost, and Allied air superiority restricted movement of messengers. In several cases, local Japanese commanders effectively conducted independent delaying actions, guided by earlier general directives rather than real-time orders. Civilian populations experienced the intensification of the campaign in varied ways depending on location. In coastal towns now under Allied control, residents faced the consequences of bombardment damage, shortages of imported goods, and disruptions to local trade, but also saw the gradual restoration of markets and municipal administration under a combination of pre-war Filipino officials and newly appointed personnel. In interior regions where Japanese forces remained, villagers frequently found themselves between opposing armed groups. Requisitioning of food, forced labor on defensive works, and suspicion of collaboration affected relations with Japanese units, while guerrilla demands for intelligence, carriers, or guides placed additional burdens on communities attempting to maintain agriculture and basic livelihoods. Politically, the escalation of fighting in the Visayas intersected with the broader re-establishment of the Commonwealth government. As areas were secured, representatives of the restored Philippine administration, accompanied by U.S. civil affairs teams, began to reassert authority, register local officials, and reopen courts and schools where conditions allowed. Guerrilla leaders who had exercised de facto control over rural districts now interacted with formal state structures, sometimes integrating into the recognized constabulary, or army units, sometimes retaining separate organizations while awaiting clearer post-war arrangements. The ongoing presence of Japanese forces in the mountains meant that in many municipalities, civil governance and military operations proceeded in parallel rather than in a clear sequence. Weather and terrain amplified the crisis phase of the campaign. The mix of coastal plains, sugarcane fields, and steep interior ranges on Negros, and the heavily folded hills north of Cebu City, limited the use of armor and made artillery deployment dependent on road access. Rainfall turned tracks into mud, affecting both sides' ability to move heavy equipment. Japanese commanders attempted to exploit these conditions by choosing defensive lines along ridges and river valleys where attacking infantry would have to approach in narrow formations. U.S. and guerrilla units responded with flanking patrols, small unit infiltration, and increased use of airstrikes against identified strongpoints, but such methods took time and added to the cumulative wear on personnel. Internationally, the battle for the Visayas did not draw the same level of attention as the contemporaneous campaigns on Luzon, Iwo Jima, or later Okinawa, yet it formed part of the Allied effort to close remaining gaps in the Pacific network of bases. Reports from the Philippines merged into broader assessments that Japan's capacity to contest sea and air control was diminishing, but also noted that garrisons such as those on Negros and Cebu continued to resist despite isolation. For the Japanese High Command, these pockets of resistance served as indicators of continued military presence in the southern Philippines, even as strategic decision-making focused increasingly on the defense of the home islands. By mid-1945, the escalation of fighting in the Visayas had produced a situation in which organized Japanese forces were largely confined to interior strongholds, while coastal and lowland areas were under Allied and guerrilla control. The crisis phase did not involve a single decisive engagement, but rather the accumulation of numerous small battles, ambushes, and clearance operations, each contributing to attrition in personnel, resources, and civilian resilience. The stage was set for the peak of the campaign, when sustained efforts to reduce these mountain positions would determine the final shape of control over the central Philippine islands. The peak of the Visayan campaign came in the late spring and early summer of 1945, when the remaining Japanese forces were concentrated in interior strongholds that required sustained, methodical operations to reduce. On Negros, after Bacolod and Talisay were secured, the 40th Infantry Division reorganized for a push into the north-central mountains. Intelligence from captured documents and guerrilla reports indicated that approximately 7,000 Japanese personnel, including Army infantry, service units, and naval detachments, had established defensive zones along ridges and in forested valleys, using caves, trenches, and concealed firing positions to compensate for shortages of heavy weapons and ammunition. American commanders divided their effort into multiple axes. Infantry battalions advanced in column along narrow roads and trails, with attached artillery where terrain allowed and air support available when weather was suitable. Guerrilla units, often familiar with local paths and water sources, operated on the flanks and ahead of the main forces, reporting on Japanese positions and cutting smaller groups off from supply routes. Progress was measured in short distances. Hill masses and ravines that appeared minor on maps often required several days of patrols, probing attacks, and engineering work before they could be secured. On Cebu, the focus of operations shifted from the coastal belt around Cebu City to the hilly interior stretching northward. The Americal Division organized a series of drives along the main road and across adjacent ridgelines, facing a Japanese force that had dwindled from pre-battle estimates of roughly 14,500 to a smaller number of effectives but retained coherent defensive sectors. Strong points were arranged to cover likely avenues of approach with interlocking fields of fire, and withdrawal routes led deeper into the hills, enabling defenders to avoid encirclement. American companies advancing along the road encountered machine gun and mortar fire from slopes above, requiring infantry to climb and clear positions by small unit maneuver supported by artillery registered onto known features. Air power played a prominent role during this peak period. Tactical aircraft based at restored fields on Panay and Cebu flew missions against identified Japanese camps, supply dumps, and concentration areas. Pilots used visual spotting, guerrilla signals, and ground liaison teams to direct strikes onto hill positions that were difficult to approach directly. While the dense vegetation and use of caves limited the permanent destruction of some installations, air attacks disrupted movement by day and forced Japanese units to rely increasingly on night marches and improvised shelters. For Japanese commanders, this phase meant managing diminishing resources while attempting to maintain organized resistance. Orders emphasized conserving ammunition, avoiding engagements in open terrain, and exploiting knowledge of local geography to impose delays rather than holding fixed lines at all costs. As supplies ran low, some units reduced rates of fire and restricted the use of mortars and artillery to specific pre-planned engagements. Communications between separate clusters in the mountains sometimes failed, leading to uneven patterns of resistance in which some groups continued fighting, while others broke into smaller parties that moved deeper into remote areas. Civilians in the interior zones experienced these peak operations as a period of frequent troop movements, requisitions, and displacement. Japanese formations passing through villages drew on local food stocks and labor to transport supplies, while guerrilla and American patrols sought information and guides. In some regions, inhabitants evacuated hamlets near suspected Japanese camps to avoid being caught in crossfire or accused of aiding one side or the other. In coastal towns and lowland agricultural areas, the consolidation of Allied control allowed for limited resumption of planting, trade, and schooling, but uncertainty about fighting in nearby hills remained a persistent feature of daily life. By mid-1945, the cumulative effect of these coordinated advances, air and artillery support, and guerrilla pressure had produced a situation in which Japanese forces on Negros and Cebu still held pockets of rugged terrain, but had lost control of major roads, ports, and population centers. The campaign had reached its most intensive operational tempo. Multiple battalions engaged on dispersed fronts, continuous patrolling in difficult landscapes, and ongoing interactions between regular troops, irregular forces, and civilian communities. The next stage would determine whether these interior strongholds could be maintained as organized defensive systems or would fragment under attrition and isolation. As the battle in the Visayas settled into a prolonged campaign, all participants adapted their methods to the changing conditions. Japanese forces, pressed into mountain areas and cut off from external resupply, shifted from organized linear defense to a more fragmented pattern of resistance. Larger units broke into smaller groups occupying dispersed camps, often concealed in ravines or dense forest. Fixed bunkers around roads and villages gave way to temporary firing positions and observation posts designed to be abandoned after short engagements. This adaptation aimed to preserve manpower, complicate Allied targeting, and prolong resistance despite shortages of ammunition and food. On Negros, Japanese detachments established a network of camps in the interior, linked by narrow trails and supported by small cultivated plots or requisition from nearby settlements. Patrols focused on monitoring Allied movements and choosing locations for ambushes along tracks and streams. On Cebu, defenders used ridges north of the city as a series of fallback zones, leaving only small groups near main routes and withdrawing deeper into the hills when faced with concentrated attacks. These methods reduced the likelihood of large encirclements, but gradually eroded central control, as isolated groups operated on the basis of earlier instructions rather than continuous direction from higher headquarters. American and Filipino forces also adapted. U.S. infantry battalions reorganized their companies into smaller patrol bases, from which squads and platoons conducted regular sweeps rather than continuous frontal advances. Training in patrolling, night operations, and coordination with air and artillery was reinforced by experience gained during the campaign. Liaison with guerrilla units became more formalized, with designated officers and teams responsible for integrating local intelligence, guides, and scouts into daily operations. On some islands, guerrilla formations were attached to U.S. regiments for specific missions, combining local terrain knowledge with heavier firepower. Guerrilla organizations themselves adjusted to the transition from clandestine resistance to open cooperation with regular forces. In areas already cleared of major Japanese formations, units took on more explicit policing and security roles, guarding roads, bridges, and supply depots. In regions still contested, they refined early warning systems using runners, signal fires, and radio links to report Japanese movements and to mark targets for airstrikes. Access to captured weapons, ammunition, and limited Allied supplies allowed some guerrilla units to rearm and standardize equipment, improving their ability to operate alongside U.S. troops. Resource management became a central concern. Allied engineers experimented with different solutions for moving supplies into mountain zones, light bridges for rivers, ropeways in some steep areas, and improvised depots closer to the front lines to reduce the distance carried by porters. Airdrops were used occasionally for isolated patrols or guerrilla units. Japanese groups, facing declining stocks, implemented rationing systems and sought to grow small gardens near camps, though these efforts were vulnerable to detection. In some districts, villagers hid portions of their harvest to avoid complete requisition by any of the armed actors, creating a patchwork of cooperation, evasion, and negotiation. Psychological adaptation accompanied these practical changes. For American soldiers, the expectation of rapid, decisive battles gave way to routine patrols, exposure to climate and disease, and uncertainty about the location of an opponent who often avoided direct confrontation. Unit reports note the cumulative effects of fatigue and the challenge of maintaining alertness during repeated operations in similar terrain. Guerrilla fighters, many of whom had been in combat or underground activity since 1942, faced the combined pressures of continuing military duties and emerging discussions about their future status in the restored Philippine state. Japanese personnel contended with news of the broader war's course reaching them in fragmentary form. Rumors of events on Luzon, Iwo Jima, and the Japanese home islands filtered through captured newspapers, broadcasts intercepted on concealed radios, or conversations with civilians. Some officers emphasized continued resistance as a contribution to the overall defensive effort, while others focused on maintaining order and discipline within units confronted by hunger and illness. In this environment, the enforcement of regulations, the role of junior leaders, and the cohesion of small groups became crucial factors in sustaining organized activity. Civilians adjusted daily life to a landscape shaped by multiple authorities. In Allied-held towns, residents navigated new regulations on movement, curfews, and requisitions to support military operations, while slowly re-establishing markets, transport, and schooling. In rural areas near Japanese camps, families developed strategies to reduce risk, such as moving fields farther from main tracks, storing food in dispersed locations, or sending relatives to stay with kin in safer zones. Community leaders often acted as intermediaries, dealing with requests and demands from Japanese forces, guerrillas, and later Allied patrols. Across the Visayas, this phase of resistance and adaptation did not produce sudden changes in front lines, but gradually altered the balance of capabilities. Japanese forces retained the capacity to inflict casualties and disrupt movement in selected areas, yet their fragmentation and resource constraints limited the scale of their operations. Allied and guerrilla units improved their coordination, refined techniques for operating in difficult terrain, and expanded control over lowlands and key communication routes. These cumulative adjustments prepared the conditions for the later turning point, when the remaining Japanese strongholds would face increasing isolation in both military and political terms. The turning point of the Visayan campaign did not occur in a single battle, but through the cumulative effects of attrition, isolation, and strategic developments elsewhere in the Pacific. By July 1945, Japanese formations on Negros and Cebu had lost control of major transport routes in coastal towns, and their ability to influence events beyond their immediate surroundings had sharply diminished. Reports from U.S. and guerrilla headquarters describe Japanese groups restricted to mountain areas, with movements largely at night and limited to small parties, communication between separate clusters became sporadic, and some units no longer received regular orders from higher command. On Negros, sustained advances by elements of the 40th Infantry Division, in cooperation with large guerrilla contingents, gradually compressed Japanese positions in the north-central highlands. Patrols reached areas previously regarded as rear bases for the defenders, capturing documents, supply caches, and field hospitals. As roads and tracks leading into the mountains came under regular Allied surveillance, Japanese units faced increased difficulty moving food, ammunition, and wounded personnel. Skirmishes continued, but the pattern of engagement shifted. Instead of organized counterattacks, Allied patrols more often encountered small defensive stands or attempts by Japanese groups to disengage and relocate. On Cebu, the American Division and attached guerrilla forces extended control along the northern road and into interior ridges, reducing the space available for Japanese maneuver. Key villages that had served as way stations between coastal and mountain areas came under Allied administration, further constraining the flow of information and supplies to remaining Japanese camps. Over time, the defenders' effective radius of action narrowed, and their activities became more focused on local survival than on coordinated operational objectives. Strategic events beyond the Visayas reinforced this turning point. The continuing advance of Allied forces toward Okinawa and the Japanese home islands signaled that the main focus of the war had shifted far to the north. In the Philippines, campaigns on Luzon and Mindanao reduced the remaining Japanese capacity to project power, while naval and air forces maintained control of surrounding seas. For Japanese soldiers in the Visayan Mountains, news of these developments arrived in fragments, but gradually created a sense that their theater could no longer alter the broader outcome of the conflict. Within this context, the decision by Japanese leaders in Tokyo to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration in August 1945 had direct consequences for the remaining garrisons in the Visayas. Imperial broadcasts and subsequent orders transmitted through surviving command channels instructed commanders to cease offensive operations and prepare to surrender to Allied forces. On Negros and Cebu, these messages did not reach all units simultaneously, but where they did, senior officers faced the task of explaining the change of policy to troops who had been told for years that they were expected to continue resisting. The transition from combat to surrender created its own dynamics. Some Japanese commanders initiated contact through intermediaries, often Filipino civilians or guerrilla leaders, to arrange local ceasefires and organize the handover of weapons and documents. Others required additional confirmation before acting, concerned about the authenticity of messages or the reactions of subordinates. In a number of cases, Japanese groups remained in remote camps until Allied patrols or guerrilla units reached them with written orders and guarantees of personal safety in accordance with surrender procedures. For American and guerrilla forces, the turning point required a shift from offensive patrolling to a combination of security, disarmament, and verification tasks. Units were instructed to receive surrendered personnel, register their identities, and supervise the collection of weapons, equipment, and maps. At the same time, they continued to conduct reconnaissance to ensure that no significant armed groups remained unaware of or opposed to the surrender orders. This phase demanded careful coordination between military and civil affairs authorities, as the presence of large numbers of disarmed Japanese troops in temporary camps raised questions about supply, health, and eventual repatriation. Civilians encountered this turning point, both as an end to organized combat and as the beginning of a complex period of adjustment. In regions where fighting had been intense, inhabitants observed Japanese columns moving under guard toward coastal assembly areas and saw the removal or destruction of fortifications that had dominated the landscape. In towns and villages, attention turned to clearing mines and unexploded munitions, restoring bridges, and re-establishing agriculture on land that had been contested or abandoned. For communities that had dealt with multiple armed actors over several years, the cessation of hostilities did not immediately resolve questions of property, authority, and responsibility, but it did mark a clear change in the daily risks associated with the presence of armed groups. By the late months of 1945, These developments had transformed the situation in the Visayas from one of active operations to one in which Japanese forces were concentrated in surrender camps. Allied and guerrilla units shifted toward occupation and security duties, and civilian society began to reorganize under restored Philippine institutions. The turning point thus combined military, political, and social elements. The loss of operational mobility by Japanese garrisons, the impact of decisions taken in Tokyo and Allied capitals, and the choices of local actors who facilitated the transition from dispersed resistance to formal capitulation. The end of combat operations in the Visayas unfolded through a series of local surrenders, formal ceremonies, and administrative measures rather than a single decisive event. After the announcement of Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration in August 1945, Japanese commanders on Negros, Cebu, Panay, and other islands gradually concentrated their personnel at prearranged assembly points. In many cases, small units walked out of mountain camps along the same trails they had used during the campaign, this time carrying folded flags and stacked weapons to be handed over at road junctions, coastal villages, or improvised collection centers under Allied supervision. On Negros, groups that had been operating in the north-central highlands moved toward coastal zones, where American and guerrilla forces had established reception sites. Surrendered personnel were registered, disarmed, and organized into temporary camps near ports and airfields to facilitate later transfer. On Cebu, Japanese soldiers came down from ridgetop positions north of Cebu City in columns supervised by their own officers and escorted by guerrilla and U.S. patrols. Similar processes took place on Panay and smaller islands, where remaining garrisons or stragglers were brought in through a combination of formal orders, local negotiations, and continued patrolling. The withdrawal from mountain positions revealed the material traces of prolonged isolation: camps built on narrow terraces, concealed storage pits, small gardens, and improvised medical stations. Allied and guerrilla inspection teams documented quantities of small arms, mortars, and ammunition, alongside stocks of rice and other foodstuffs at various stages of depletion. In some locations, burial sites and makeshift cemeteries indicated the toll of disease and malnutrition. These findings contributed to a fuller understanding of how Japanese forces had sustained themselves after losing contact with regular supply lines. For American and Filipino forces, the immediate post-surrender period involved a change of tasks rather than an abrupt end to activity. Units that had previously conducted offensive operations were now responsible for guarding POW camps, escorting prisoners to transports, and assisting in the clearance of mines, booby traps, and unexploded ordnance in former battle areas. Engineers focused on restoring key routes and facilities, repairing bridges, grading roads damaged by heavy traffic and weather, and making docks safe for increased shipping. Medical personnel screened both surrendered soldiers and local inhabitants for diseases that had spread during the years of occupation and combat. Guerrilla organizations underwent a parallel transition. In many districts, units that had operated as de facto local authorities since 1942 were asked to hand over weapons, register personnel, and integrate selected members into the reconstituted Philippine Army or constabulary. Others disbanded and returned to civilian occupations. This process raised questions about recognition, rank, and compensation, which were only partly resolved in the immediate aftermath. Nevertheless, guerrilla leaders in the Visayas generally cooperated with disarmament and demobilization procedures while continuing to play prominent roles in local politics and administration. For civilians, the withdrawal of Japanese forces and the end of active operations brought a mixture of relief and new challenges. Families that had taken shelter in interior villages or coastal barrios began to return to towns and fields that had been shelled, mined, or used as camps. In urban centers such as Iloilo, Bacolod, and Cebu City, residents confronted war damage to warehouses, piers, schools, and churches, as well as shortages of imported goods and disruption of pre-war trade patterns. Rural communities had to repair irrigation systems, replant fields, and rebuild houses using limited materials, often under the guidance of local committees working with civil affairs officers. The presence of surrendered Japanese personnel created additional demands on resources. camps required food, medical care, and basic infrastructure until arrangements could be made for transport and repatriation. Local authorities and Allied officers sought to prevent unauthorized exchanges or conflicts between prisoners and the surrounding population, particularly in areas where memories of occupation policies and counterinsurgency operations were still fresh. At the same time, investigations into specific incidents during the occupation, such as executions, forced labor, or reprisals, began to collect testimonies and documents that would later inform legal proceedings. Economically, the immediate post-war period in the Visayas was marked by both disruption and potential. Sugar, copra, and other agricultural products that had formed the basis of pre-war exports had suffered from neglect, requisition, and damage to transport links. Re-establishing production required credit, equipment, and access to markets, all of which depended on broader reconstruction policies at the national and Allied levels. In the short term, many communities relied on subsistence agriculture, local barter, and limited relief supplies while larger reconstruction plans were formulated. Administratively, the restored Commonwealth government expanded its presence through provincial and municipal offices, courts, and police forces. Pre-war officials, leaders who had worked with guerrillas, and newly appointed figures all participated in rebuilding local institutions. Questions about collaboration, resistance, and responsibility during the occupation surfaced in debates over appointments and informal inquiries. These processes varied from one locality to another, reflecting differences in wartime experiences and in the balance of local political forces. By the end of 1945, organized Japanese military presence in the Visayas had effectively ended, with surrendered personnel concentrated in camps, awaiting transport, and civilian governance re-established across the main islands. However, the consequences of the battle and the wider occupation remained visible in damaged infrastructure, altered patterns of land use, and the social adjustments of communities that had lived for years under shifting authorities. The withdrawal phase thus closed the military chapter of the campaign, while opening a complex period of humanitarian, economic, and political recovery, whose effects would extend well beyond the formal end of hostilities. In the longer perspective of the Pacific War, the battle for the Visayas formed one element of a wider process in which Japan lost control of its outer defense zones and of the sea and air routes that linked the home islands to resources in Southeast Asia. Militarily, the operations on Panay, Negros, Cebu, Bohol, and nearby islands removed organized Japanese garrisons from the central belt of the Philippines, secured internal shipping lanes between Luzon and Mindanao, and provided additional airfields and ports for Allied logistics. By mid-1945, aircraft and shipping operating from Visayan bases supported movements toward Mindanao and the Netherlands East Indies, and contributed to the broader isolation of remaining Japanese positions in Borneo and the East Indies archipelagos. For the United States, the campaign confirmed certain operational concepts developed earlier in the Philippines. The combination of relatively small amphibious forces, extensive air and naval support, and cooperation with local guerrilla organizations became a reference point in post-war analyses of island operations. Staff studies noted both the advantages and limitations of relying on dispersed local allies, the challenges of sustaining multiple simultaneous campaigns with finite shipping and engineer resources, and the effects of terrain and climate on efforts to dislodge opponents from interior strongholds. Lessons drawn from the Visayas appeared in later doctrinal discussions on counterinsurgency, joint operations, and the use of indigenous forces alongside regular troops. For the Philippines, the Visayan campaign had lasting political and social implications. The participation of guerrilla forces, many of which had been organized along regional lines, influenced post-war debates about national integration, veterans' benefits, and the structure of the armed forces. Recognition of service, allocation of ranks, and access to pensions became recurrent topics in legislative and public discussions. At the same time, the campaign highlighted variations in wartime experience between regions that had seen early liberation and those where fighting continued into 1945, contributing to diverse local narratives about occupation, resistance, and liberation. Economic consequences were also significant. Pre-war Visayan economies had relied heavily on sugar, copra, and inter-island trade. Wartime damage to plantations, transport links, and port facilities, combined with shifts in global markets after 1945, altered patterns of production and land use. Reconstruction programs introduced new infrastructure and credit schemes, but also raised questions about land ownership, the position of large estates, and the relationship between rural producers and export markets. In some areas, disputes over land and labor that had been muted during the occupation resurfaced, shaped in part by wartime alignments and the status of former guerrillas and collaborationist officials. In Japanese historical memory, the garrisons in the Visayas came to represent one of many peripheral theaters where units continued to operate after being cut off from the main fronts. Post-war accounts by former officers and soldiers emphasized long periods of isolation, efforts to maintain discipline and supply in remote camps, and the circumstances of surrender following the imperial order to cease hostilities. These narratives often place the Visayas alongside other Philippine and Pacific islands as examples of how dispersed Japanese forces experienced the final phase of the war away from large set-piece battles. Commemoration in the Visayas itself has taken multiple forms. Monuments, plaques, and annual ceremonies in cities such as Iloilo, Bacolod, Cebu, and smaller towns recall both guerrilla activity and the arrival of Allied forces. Local histories, school curricula, and museum exhibits present the campaign through the lens of community experience, emphasizing occupation, resistance networks, and the transition to restored self-government. In some locations, former battlefields and surrender sites are marked, while in others the physical traces of the campaign have been absorbed into urban expansion or agricultural land. Historians have debated the relative significance of the Visayan operations within the overall Philippine and Pacific campaigns. Some studies argue that the main determinants of Japan's defeat lay in larger battles and strategic bombing, while others highlight the cumulative impact of clearing secondary theaters, which removed remaining bases, freed Allied forces for redeployment, and shaped post-war political structures in liberated territories. Analyses also compare casualty figures, resource expenditures, and timelines with those of operations on Luzon, Leyte, and Mindanao, noting the distinctive role of guerrilla regular cooperation in the Visayas. Over time, the battle for the Visayas has been integrated into broader discussions about occupation and decolonization. The interaction of Japanese military rule, American military return, and the reestablishment of the Philippine Commonwealth created a layered sequence of authorities within a short period. The campaign's legacy includes not only military outcomes, but also the reshaping of institutions, economies, and local identities in the Central Philippines. In this way, the events of 1945 in the Visayas are linked both to the conclusion of a global conflict and to the subsequent history of an independent Philippine state.